Hello and welcome to your month ahead video for the month of June 2015. We definitely have a very powerful month of astrology in store. I think the key words of this month that I'd like to really share with you are perspective, confidence, dignity, and desire. These are the words for June. A big key player on the astrological scene over the course of the last several weeks has been Mercury retrograde. Mercury has been in the nakshatra or lunar mansion of Rohini, and Rohini is concerned primarily with the concept of growth, evolution. It's involved in evolution. So there's been a process, as generally tends to happen on the reflective level with Mercury retrograde periods. There's been a period of reflection. What you're doing is going over old ground and you're looking at where you have grown, where you have evolved, and what areas of your life are still needing growth. So if you find yourself revisiting scenes from the past, only looking at them in a completely different way, well, that's showing you that you've made some progress over the course of the last several months. A lot of powerful aspects going on this month. We start the month off with a full moon in Sagittarius, and I'm going to go into each of these. And the full moon will be in Sagittarius and Jyeshta Nakshatra. And then that's also coinciding with a tense aspect between Mars and Pluto. Mars is kind of considered Pluto's little brother, so it's very powerful energy when those two planets interact with each other, and especially when they're in a tense angle with each other, it can make things pretty explosive. A trine between Venus and Saturn is also in the equation at one point this month. Mercury stations and turns back direct as Neptune stations and goes retrograde for several months. Saturn, as it's in its retrograde motion, is going to backtrack into Scorpio this month, and Jupiter will form a harmonious angle with Uranus. And after that, then we'll have Venus also forming the very same aspect with Uranus. Let's go into each of these aspects, breaking them down, at least the major aspects of the month, day by day, so that we can take a more in-depth look at what's going on. So as I was saying, we're starting the month off with a very powerful full moon in Sagittarius, and this in the nakshatra of Jyeshta. What makes it so powerful is happening on the same day as a tenth angle known as a quincunx between Mars and Pluto. With Sagittarius and the full moon in Sagittarius, there's an energy of looking at your options for the future, and after going through a more involuted process in coordination with Mercury retrograde, there's a growing level of confidence. Jyeshta always provides perspective. The way I often like to describe Jyeshta energy to people, Jyeshta can help you to step back from a perplexing situation and give you the insight and also strength with which to overcome a difficult set of circumstances. So tying in with the whole Mercury retrograde period, because Jyeshta itself is also ruled by Mercury. So Mercury is very much going to tie into the equation. And so the full moon will be in Jyeshta, and Mercury is over across the sky in Rohini Nakshatra, which is ruled by the moon. So there's an interchange of energy between Mercury and the moon going on that makes this process even more powerful. But there's a renewed sense of confidence after going through the lessons of the past. You're feeling more confident about your options for the future. But it's not that that confidence is necessarily going to dwindle, but it's much more the concept that there may be some tension connected with the processes that are associated with that. Because as I was mentioning, Mars in Gemini is going to be forming a tenth angle known as a quincunx with Pluto in Capricorn, right? So Mars is in Gemini, Pluto is in Capricorn, and a quincunx is a 150-degree angle. It's a minor tension, but when you're dealing with two explosive planets, even minor tension can kindle a pretty big fire, if you know what I'm talking about. And Mars will be in Mrigashira, which is actually ruled by Mars. And with Mrigashira, some of the qualities associated with that are taking something apart, looking at it in a different way and putting it back together again in a new way. And Mrigashira is very strong on the concept of longing for fulfillment, longing to fulfill a desire. So there's a longing, there's a sense of pining. And that's not matching up with what's going on with Pluto. Pluto is in Purva Ashadha. Now, with Purva Ashadha, there's always a process of peeling away at the layers of the ego that keep you from being true to your authentic nature. Okay? So somewhere there is part of you that if you were to look at a particular process and some of the options that are on offer for you, even though those options are likely presenting you with some very tempting possibilities, you may be sitting with it and going, well, I have this set of ideals or this set of beliefs, and that feels more true and authentic to my nature. And I don't know if I really want to take the necessary steps in order to sacrifice those particular things. And so there's a need to look at that particular type of situation. And we'll see how this evolves over the course of the month. On the 5th, you've got Venus. Having finished its journey through Cancer, it's going to be entering the sign of Leo for the month. Over the course of the month, it will make some very interesting angles. As I was talking about at the end of the month, it forms a harmonious angle with Uranus. We're going to go more over the process of Venus and Leo when we touch on the aspects that it makes a little bit later on. So we're not going to go too into depth with that. On the 6th, you've got the Sun forming the very same angle with Pluto that Mars was. So the Sun and Pluto will quincunx each other. I'll name all these off and then I'll go over them again, right? And you also have Mars forming a harmonious angle with Jupiter while Venus is trining Saturn. So the Sun in Gemini, right, looking at several different possibilities at the same time and shedding more light on those desires that were associated with the Mars-Pluto tension. It's shedding more light on that situation and still going through the process of going, does this sit right with me? Does this feel like it's in alignment with who I am inside? Or am I in a position of putting up a front just so I can achieve something or get through a situation or try to make something better in my life? This is happening at the same time that Mars is forming a harmonious angle with Jupiter. Mars is also in Mrigashira, but in a different section of Mrigashira, because all these nakshatras will have several different sections associated with them, and planets are going to behave in different manners dependent upon where they're at in that nakshatra. So with Mars in Mrigashira, in the section that it's in when it's forming an angle with Jupiter, what we've got going on is the sense of desire, sense of longing for fulfillment deepens until one is almost merging with the object of what one is wishing to pursue or what one is going after, okay? And as that's forming a harmonious angle with Jupiter in Leo, again, we're looking at this whole concept of dignity and we're looking at a concept of confidence because Jupiter is in Maga. One of the things that's connected with Maga, it's symbolized by a palanquin, which used to be used to carry royalty through the village on the back of servants, so to speak. So when you're dealing with processes related to Maga, one of the things that's going to come into the equation is dignity, how one's dignity is going to be affected. That's part of the equation. Maga is also associated with the ancestors. So again, there can be the concept of going back over the past and really analyzing a situation before one moves forward. Jupiter is about expansion. So even though one is merged in a particular set of circumstances, there's two ways that this energy can work, and likely it will work in both of these ways, is that the sense of longing and pining deepens, and one is able to take a look at things from a more analytical level so that one is able to make an appropriate decision that's related to this particular set of circumstances. Mixed in with that, there's also the sense of power building to a deeper level, or longing building to a deeper level, to the extent that an impulse can't be denied and doesn't really need to be. And so one has a lot more strength behind the work that they're putting into the particular goal that they're trying to achieve. Now, this coincides with Venus forming a harmonious angle with Saturn. And let's touch a little bit on Venus first, because one of the things that people often forget in terms of Venus is each planet is kind of related to a particular aspect of a royal court. And Venus is the minister, the person who gives advice. So there's always is this a wise choice thought with Venus? Is this a refined choice? Because Venus is about refinement. So it's going over your choices and refining your options. And Venus will be in Pusha Nakshatra. With Pusha, there is quite often the recognition and acceptance of one's limitations. So accepting one's destiny, accepting what one is able to do, recognizing one's potential. And that's a very positive thing, but also accepting the restrictions. And it's that side of the restrictions that we need to take a look at, because Saturn in Anuradha, which is also ruled by Saturn, is going to want to teach the concept of proper boundaries. Um, how far should I go? How far is enough? How far is too little? How far is too much? And there's been an energy of restriction that's been applying up until this date. And both Pusha and Anuradha are ruled by Saturn. So there's a very Saturnian energy that's connected with this. But there's an acceptance of the limitations that are there. Sometimes limitations are good. As I was talking in the lunar scope last night, which was the 31st of May lunar scope, if you're going back and listening to this later on in the month, I was talking about the concept of limitations quite often keep us from going off the deep end. So even though we may not like the fact that our choices are limited from time to time, it's actually positive, because it's as if the universe is protecting us from making a wrong choice. And as the energy at the end of May built up and is building to this, we can see how that restriction that was there actually served a purpose, because now there's an acceptance of the limitations and recognizing the things that are good for us and the things that weren't good for us. And with that, there's strength, there's power, there's knowledge, and there's wisdom. And with all those factors combined, there's a sense of knowing and a sense of confidence. And that's where Maga comes back into the equation, the concept of dignity. So although there might be questions coming into the equation of going, is this something that's going to sap my confidence if I make a mistake, or is this something that's good for me? Well, ultimately, there's the recognition that one should just accept the limitations that are there, act with the wise knowledge that one has, but also with strength and confidence. Now, on the 8th, the Sun will make the very same angle to Jupiter that Mars has done. Because the important thing to recognize is that for the early part of the month, Mars and the Sun are going to be traveling in close proximity to each other. We're going to come back to that later on, and I'm also want to touch on a fact before I go into this Sun-Jupiter aspect, because when a planet is close to the Sun, it sometimes becomes frustrated by the rays of the Sun. So there can be the concept of frustration, and when that happens with Mars, Mars can turn into a pretty angry character, and his desire to act becomes even more inflamed and sometimes boldened. Sometimes that sense of being boldened is good for the equation, and sometimes it's not quite so good for the equation. But as we're talking about the process relating to around the 8th, I think it's ultimately pretty good for the equation. Some of those things would depend upon where it's falling in your particular birth chart, of course. But with the Sun also in Mrigashira, forming a harmonious aspect with Jupiter. Again, this is the concept of shedding further light on the situation. So maybe there's the process of not being able to act immediately, a growing sense of confidence, not being able to act immediately, but that's actually good, because then the Sun is going to show a little bit more of the details as it's forming a harmonious angle with Jupiter, because the important thing we need to remember with the Sun is it is the light bearer. It's also the planet that gives you a sense of steadfastness and strength. The Sun is a very strong character. That's why it's able to burn so brightly. And it's also the strength of the soul. And it'll be forming a harmonious angle with Jupiter, which again is going to be about expansion. And this aspect itself is going to be pretty powerful, because Jupiter is in Leo, which is also ruled by the Sun. So the Sun is aspecting a planet in its own sign. And that'll make that aspect a little more powerful. So again, going over the details a little more deeply, probably still fine-tuning the process. And you got to watch out for that, because here comes the next one. our good old friend Uranus, right? Almost like the trickster of the zodiac. And what does Uranus like to do? It's, when old forms have been destroyed, Uranus wants to step into the equation and create something new. But he always does something in a very revolutionary process or in a very unexpected manner. He's like the quirky court jester of them all. He's always going to do something that's a little bit out of the ordinary, or should we use the word extraordinary? And Mars will be forming a harmonious alignment with Uranus. Uranus is in Revati. In Revati Nakshatra, as I've spoken on many occasions because Uranus has been there for a while, is about the ending of one phase of existence. And the next phase has not yet begun. And there's a lot of preparations that are going on in the process. And there's a bit of an internal personal revolution, spiritual revolution going on the individual level for each of us in relation to this planet. And Mars, with this sense of longing, this sense of desire that it's really wanting to immerse itself in and kind of burn with the fire of it, and really let itself, get wrapped up in the energy of the moment, so to speak, is going to be forming a harmonious angle with Uranus. This is powerful too, because Uranus is actually in Aries, which is ruled by Mars. So that makes the process even more powerful. Something random, something unexpected will happen around that date. And so even though you may have been going over all the options and think you have it all set, you've got to plan for the unexpected, because where Uranus is involved, there's always an unexpected factor. And that unexpected factor is probably going to happen as a result of becoming whipped up into a frenzy. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. As a matter of fact, factors are showing that that's a pretty positive thing. The day after, on the 10th, we've got Mercury forming a harmonious angle with Venus. And we've got the Sun forming the same harmonious angle with Uranus that Mars did the day before. So Mercury's still retrograde at this particular time, but it's beginning to slow down. And the days preceding when Mercury stations, and this is a day before, and Mercury moves pretty fast. So Mercury will probably be slowing down about the 10th into the 11th. When Mercury is beginning to slow down, it becomes very powerful. Mercury will be sextiling Venus. So there's an opportunity to take a look. As I mentioned, Mercury's in Rohini. So reflecting over, where one has grown and going deep into that wisdom and on a very determined level to get to the bottom of something. Where Venus is involved, there's always a lot of sensuality connected to it. And I don't just mean sensuality is in connected to, I'm going to go take a hot, luxurious bath or things like that. That can be included in the equation, as well as getting into an interesting conversation with somebody and enjoying the sensual tone of the conversation. But much more, what we're looking for is the sensation of being strengthened by wisdom, being strengthened by a knowing, and being able to act on something in a manner that is going to, this is going to sound rather odd, I'm going to warn you, that is going to catch a situation off guard, right? It's almost like seizing success, or the concept or illusion that you're going to be seizing success, because really it's just the universe acting through you. Every single action that you're taking in your life, that's all it is. And on one level, that takes a huge weight off of your shoulders, doesn't it? Right? So Mercury, the very next day, is going to station direct. So there's a deepening process with Mercury sextiling Venus, because Venus is in Ashleisha. And Ashleisha gets hypnotized by things, drawn in a very devoted manner to the particular thing that it's taking a look at. It's almost like fixated on it, okay? And there's the sensation of becoming fixated because of wisdom and knowledge that is coming to you based upon past circumstances. The next day, as I was saying, Mercury stations direct, and it's going to begin to move in forward motion. So then it's about what we've learned and growing with that knowledge. The very following day, on the 12th, Neptune stations retrograde for the next several months. Neptune is in Purva Bhadrapada, which is about taking the abstract and making it concrete. So ultimately, Purva Bhadrapada is always going to deal with inspiration. What inspires you? What doesn't inspire you? What makes you angry? What makes you happy? And where Neptune's involved, there are always going to be things revealed. And going through some internal adjustments, as always happens with retrograde planets, it's always an internalization of that energy. And looking at all the different forms of the things that inspire you and seeing if you can refine it all into one particular essence. And if you can refine it all into one particular essence, what is that essence composed of? Those are some of the things that are related to it. And again, this is tying in over the course of the month with the concept of looking at options, looking at where you're going for the next step. But you're wanting to make a journey where you're able to travel with a sense of dignity, not one where you're going to make mistakes and stumble over your own feet, so to speak. That's a very important energetic tone to the month. On the 14th, we've got the Sun finally forming a conjunction with Mars. Now you're ready to act. And these two planets, both very fiery planets, coming into contact with each other and making things very strong, making things very powerful. And this is in the latter stages of Gemini, ideas coming a mile a minute and ready to act upon those ideas because of the section that of Mrigashira that the Sun and Mars are occupying. It's shedding a light on that passion. It's making that passion burn even more brightly so that it takes the appropriate steps. On the 15th, Saturn retrogrades back into Scorpio, where it spent most of the last couple of years before, at the end of last year, Saturn moved into Sagittarius. Prior to that, it was traversing through Scorpio. And it's going back into Scorpio, covering some old ground, crystallizing some things associated with the past, making all that knowledge that you've learned and all the wise choices that you made, and even all the unwise choices that you made, making them more concrete so that they really stick. And with Saturn retrograde, a lot of times it's about the process of going back over all of that stuff and just really letting it crystallize and gel inside of you. Saturn is kind of like the big disciplinarian of the zodiac, and a lot of people give Saturn a bad reputation. But really, on many levels, he's going to be your best friend because he's going to make sure that you get a lot of that information right. On the 16th, we've got the new moon in Gemini, and the moon's going to be new in Mrigashira as well. Again, I want to touch on the concept of, I don't want to say the word rehabilitation, but maybe reintegration. That's a better word for it. Because with Mrigashira, there's always a process of things being dissolved or taken apart and bringing them back together again in a new way. And I'll touch a little bit on a particular story. I'm going to kind of summarize the story and not give you the full depth of it because I want to make sure that I cover all these aspects as well. There's a story in Vedic mythology about the moon eloping with Jupiter's wife. Okay, and basically Jupiter gets his wife back from the moon, but not until after the moon and Jupiter's wife had already had a child with each other, which interestingly enough became Mercury. So the moon, which represents consciousness, right, had a go with Jupiter's wife, and they had an offspring, which was Mercury. Okay, so wisdom, consciousness with wisdom creates the capacity to see things objectively and to be able to differentiate. That's part of the lesson in association with that. But we're talking about Mrigashira right now. So basically, Jupiter gets back together with his wife. They kind of let the past be the past, and he sees the child Mercury and falls basically in love with the child to the extent that he decides he wants to keep the child, which in those particular times and that myth was written, it wasn't always an equation that the father would keep the child if it was from a different marriage or different interaction, so to speak. So basically, there was the concept of Jupiter and his wife coming back together, and there's a new child, something new that's born from the particular circumstance. That's very deeply the process that's connected with Mrigashira, something kind of being taken away or broken apart and then brought back together again. And with every nakshatra that's ruled by Mars, as Mrigashira is, there's ultimately going to be a sense of dissatisfaction that's associated with the process. And there's a lot of Mrigashira energy present this month because of the Sun and Mars traveling through that particular section of the sky. On the same day that we have the new moon, we have Venus forming a tense aspect with Neptune. Venus in Ashleisha and discovering a potential, really feeling a potential, really tuning into one's higher sensory awareness, because Venus is going to have the concept of the senses associated with it. Venus will rule over those senses. And with Venus in Leo, there's a very powerful association with that. And as it's in Ashleisha, it's also being drawn very deeply into that process. And that's quincunxing Neptune. So feeling something very deeply, feeling the potential of a particular situation. But there's some tension regarding whether that is something that inspires you, whether it's something that feels good to you, whether it's something that feels bad to you. And you can take the situation apart and break it down into minute sections if you really want to. But hey, who really wants to bother? So sometimes we just got to go with the inspiration of the moment. And as there's a lot of Mars energy in the month, I think the tone that's related to this particular aspect is saying, you may end up kind of overanalyzing a situation to the extent that things become foggier more than they become clearer. And that's the Venus quincunx with Neptune. On the 20th, and this will have been applying for quite a while previous to this, and it'll be separating for quite a while after it, we've got Saturn, one of the slowest moving planets in the zodiac, forming a tense angle called a semi-square with Pluto. Both of those planets in the past used to rule death. Saturn, before the existence of Pluto, was associated with death. It still is in many senses. And Pluto is associated with death. What is death but transformation, right? But there's a lot of tension because of feeling something very deeply, but yet still feeling somewhat restricted. And it's like you're imposing a sense of self-restriction on yourself because your ego is needing to go over a situation and decide whether you're acting in a manner that's separate from the universe, which is what the ego does, or whether it actually is the fact that something is authentically coming from your soul. And you need to kind of judge from that particular process how to make the next steps in the equation. So it's a very necessary part of the process. Okay? On the 21st, we've got the Sun quincunxing Saturn, and then the Sun enters Cancer, and then Venus quincunxes Pluto. The Sun will be in Ardra at this particular point. Ardra Nakshatra has the capacity to focus very passionately and very deeply upon something. When that is something that serves our higher purpose, that's very positive. When it's something that's serving our, lower self, that's actually not the most positive thing. And sometimes with the processes connected with Ardra, we get very caught up to the extent that we have tunnel vision and we're only able to see straight ahead in the situation rather than to every side, rather than being able to see life from a panoramic view. Instead, we're seeing it from a narrow-minded perspective. And there's a process of adjustment because of the area of Ardra that the Sun is in that is making some tension with Saturn's desires to merge, because that's the area of Saturn of Anuradha that Saturn's going to be in at the time of this aspect. Less of the restrictive nature of Anuradha, because Anuradha also has a very devotional nature, but there's a sense of devotion that's there. There's the uncertainty whether one should hold oneself back or keep the focus moving straight forward. And then which idea to go with as one is doing that. Which direction to turn? Shall I hold myself back? Shall I go forward? Shall I do this? Shall I not do this? And can be an over-analytical process to this all, as you may discover at about that time. But then the Sun enters Cancer. Once the Sun enters Cancer, Cancer will tend to, even though Cancer is a very emotional sign, it also represents where the cosmic impulse comes together and begins to take shape and take form. So there's a solidity that can be connected with Cancer, even though it is a water sign. So something becomes a little firmer about that time in relation to the Sun. The Sun Venus, I should say, will also quincunx Pluto on that day, as we were saying. And Venus will be in Ashleisha, whereas Pluto will be in Purva Ashadha. So again, it's the feeling on a very deep level. This is going to be some very tense energy that you feel very passionately, because Pluto is always going to add some passion to the equation, and where you got Venus involved, there's the senses. So there's the senses connecting with that passion, but in a very flagrant or spark causing manner. So they're seeing the potential of the situation and really not knowing if this is just a superficial external action that you're taking, or whether it's something that's aligned with your heart, and you're probably going to need to chew that whole process over. Let's cover the last aspects of the month, and then let's go over each of them individually. On the 22nd, Jupiter will trine Uranus. Then the 23rd, we've got Mercury squaring Neptune, Mars conjuncting Saturn, I should say. On the 24th, then Mars enters Cancer, and on the 29th, towards the end of the month, Venus forms a harmonious angle with Uranus. Okay, let's start with Jupiter's trine with Uranus. This happened recently, several months ago. As recently as several months ago, these two planets formed a similar aspect, but Jupiter in a different section of the sky now, Jupiter in Maga, and Uranus still in Revati. There's the sense of a holding space and making some internal changes before taking movement forward. But again, there's the process of dignity, going back over old situations, because Maga is always going to do that. It's like going back over the past so that you can finally let go and move on a certain level. Maga, the energy that's connected with Maga is that of leaving the body. So again, there's the sense of transitioning that's there. And there's also the sense of dignity, being strong in your soul as you're making that transition. So it's about the changes going on in a very revolutionary manner inside of yourself. And because of those changes, being able to make the appropriate steps that are going to really help you in your forward motion. Then on the 23rd, as we were saying, Mercury will form a tense angle with Neptune. Mercury will be at that particular point still in Gemini, but moving forward, and Neptune will be still in Purva Bhadrapada. And basically, there's the concept of going over where you have grown, as I was saying, and looking at your options in moving forward, but still looking at things and going, well, does this really inspire me? What really inspires me? What is it that is bringing my sense of inspiration? What's the essence of that thing that's bringing inspiration? I don't know if you know about Vishnu in Hindu mythology, but Neptune can relate to Vishnu, and Vishnu took a lot of different incarnations, right? So there's always the concept of form being different with Neptune, but the essence being the same. So going back over the essence of what inspires you, what's frustrating you, what's making you angry, what's making you happy, and taking a look at those particular things and making the necessary adjustments that are associated with that. But there can always be a fog, especially with tense angles with Neptune in association with that. Okay, Mars will also on that very same day be quincunxing Saturn, and Mars will be in Ardra Nakshatra as well, and it's forming a tense angle with Saturn that's going, that's very deeply immersed in a situation to the extent that it doesn't want to move. Okay, Saturn doesn't move very much in the first place, right? He spends 2.5 years in each sign. But Saturn in Anuradha, and in a very devoted section of Anuradha, having a tense angle with Mars, is going to be very focused, but also making some adjustments, but still not really seeing the big picture, just seeing straight forward, right? So there's a very pronounced effort based upon a sense of devotion, but things aren't really matching up, and they're not really going right. And this can lead, especially as Mars will then the very next day be entering Cancer, where Mars is debilitated. And when Mars is in Cancer, there can be feelings of exhaustion, feeling overwhelmed emotionally in relation to a particular set of circumstances, and not really feeling quite the sense of strength as you might like to feel in relation to a particular set of circumstances. It can be very sensitive in that area of the zodiac, and that's why Mars doesn't like it there, because Mars doesn't like being sensitive. Mars just wants to get the job done, right? And when Mars has to be sensitive, well, it makes it a little more difficult. And trust me, we don't always like Mars when he gets sensitive because then he can have the capacity to get a little more angry when that happens, right? So Mars will be forming this angle with Saturn before it moves into Cancer. But there's a sense of frustration that's connected with this because things aren't going right in terms of the path ahead that one has chosen. Pardon, just have something there. And then on the 29th, towards the end of the month, we've got Venus in Magha Nakshatra, balancing things out at that particular stage of Magha Nakshatra, forming a harmonious angle with Uranus, looking at the internal guidance that one has and really letting things balance out, letting things change, looking at things differently. Maybe on one level, also wanting to very deeply manifest something that's based upon one's desires and based upon one's senses and wanting to take a revolutionary approach in doing so, but also by the same token, looking at one's dignity because Venus can be a very vain planet and Venus in Magha in Leo can behave in some very vain manners. The concept here is dignity versus pride. Obviously, there's a difference, right? With dignity, dignity is something that cannot be impacted by external sets of circumstances. It's something that's just naturally there. We use the word dignity to mean several different things. Sometimes we have an external sense of dignity, but when our pride gets hurt, when we're proud about something, that's really just because our ego needs to take a look at something. But internally, when we're connected with the soul more deeply, there's less of a sense of losing one's dignity. So there's the concept of letting things balance out, seeing how things feel, because Venus is obviously going to be about feelings too and tuning into one's senses and really knowing if something feels right for you before you take the appropriate steps that might overturn the proverbial apple cart. And if it does feel right to overturn the proverbial apple cart, pardon me, tongue twisted there, then by all means go ahead and do so. But what it will likely relate to is some internal adjustments going on, connected with one's sense of dignity, really taking more of a balanced look at a particular set of circumstances before moving forward. If this is falling in a relationship sector of your chart, you might find you unexpectedly get into a relationship at that point, but just touching on these aspects rather generally rather than individually, and I'll tell you why in a moment. So very much just about letting the process balance out so that you can then move on, but move on in a more dignified manner. Now, as I was saying, obviously each person will be affected differently in their life by all of these aspects, dependent upon where it's falling in their particular birth chart. So if you'd like to look at the month ahead, or if you just have a generally perplexing set of circumstances that you'd like a little more insight on, I do offer a vast range of astrological services that are available through the astrological services page on my website. There's a link further down in this YouTube video. If you've closed that link down already, there's also a link down in the description area of the page. Also, there's a subscribe button in this video. If you haven't subscribed yet, please feel free to do so. That way you get regular updates every time a new video is released. That's going to do it for your look at the month ahead for June 2015. Until next month, or if you're watching the lunar scopes until tomorrow, please do take the very best care of yourself. Bye for now.